transfer of technology. In this context, we hope to be able to count on the due comprehension and solidarity in international cooperation, in particular official development aid. It's essential to mobilize different sources and instruments of financing and forgiveness of external debt. This situation requires solution with a systemic approach that takes into account the impact on prices of raw materials and international trade, stability of supply chains, and income from tourism, levels of remittances, employment, and fiscal receipts. Changes in all these economic variables, especially for developing countries, could put many of these countries at the risk of taking on too much debt, both internally and externally. In the face of this situation, it's important to ensure mechanisms of easing the debt burden, and international financial organizations must continue to provide liquidity and debt forgiveness. Mr. President, current challenges require close cooperation among states. In a world of interconnected threats, solidarity must be in the interest of all states and all international actors. Any situation must be dealt with through multilateralism. Therefore, Bolivia would like to reaffirm its determination to work with the international community, always respecting the principles of solidarity, equality among states, the self-determination of peoples, national sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence. Thank you very much.
I wish to thank the Constitutional President of the Republic of the Plurinational State of Bolivia for the statement just made. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ecuador to introduce an address by the head of state.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to introduce the pre-recorded message of the President of the Republic of Ecuador, Lenin Moreno Garces. Mr. President of the General Assembly, Secretary General, Heads of State and Government, please accept the heartfelt greetings of the Ecuadorian people. Dear friends, this meeting and all those that we have held over recent months have one common denominator, namely understanding that international cooperation has never been as necessary and important as it is today, as it is now. If we don't strengthen multilateralism, there will be no way to put the brakes on the dramatic effects of the pandemic. We won't have the capacity to provide a comprehensive response to a threat that is not only a health threat, but also an economic, social, and political one. The pandemic has had unprecedented effects, and not all countries have had the same capacity to respond effectively to its impacts. This is why we insist so much on timely and efficient assistance in a spirit of solidarity. To whom? Well, to the economies that are least developed and to middle and low-income countries. It's fundamental that donor countries intensify their efforts to provide development assistance. Of course, I'm referring to those that have not yet done this, because for those that have, to them we're very grateful. In crises as difficult as this one, the support of international financial organizations means not only solving lives, but also ensuring the survival of entire peoples. In the case of Ecuador, the support that we received made it possible for us to face the most difficult days of this pandemic. And today, as the reactivation of our economy is in full swing, the loans on excellent conditions that we received were fundamental in order to protect employment and dollarization. The people of Ecuador are very grateful to you for this. Fellow mandate holders, the history of humanity will have a before and an after COVID. Unfortunately, the after period will include poverty, unemployment, and inequality, as happened after the war. If we don't reactivate immediately technical and economic resources, it will be very difficult to recover. The recovery will be very difficult and long, 3 or 4 years. And probably we won't be able to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, and maybe on some of them we will backtrack on those that we had achieved. The pandemic worsened inequality in various aspects, and it laid bare once again the economic and technological gaps existing throughout the world. As always happens, those most affected have been those that are the most vulnerable, because today technology is the basis for access to telemedicine, tele-education and teleworking. COVID also revealed the dual vulnerability of women, children, older persons, persons with disabilities, and indigenous peoples, and migrants. The loss of employment, violence within the family, poverty have all increased during lockdown and have worsened dramatically the situation for these groups of people. To this we must protect them, and we must guarantee their rights today. They need us more than ever before. Ecuador supports the work of the World Health Organization and its leadership shown during this emergency. Its coordination will be a determining factor in ensuring access for everyone to the COVID-19 vaccines, and also access to patent-free technologies for medicines that can be distributed in a fair manner. The only way that we can overcome the pandemic and its effects will be to work together in a coordinated and integrated manner. Now is not the time for geopolitical battles. It's a time for solidarity and cohesion to facilitate access to humanitarian aid for our peoples. The pandemic should be an additional reason to speed up the obligations of disarmament and to free up resources that are so necessary for our economic recovery. It is a moral obligation, our moral obligation, to rechannel our efforts to address COVID-19. This is our common enemy. The 7.7 billion inhabitants of the world need us to be united, and they are calling for urgent action to be taken by everyone. This is the time to demonstrate that the reasons that justified the creation at the time of the United Nations Organization, and above all, to demonstrate that this body is effective when the global community needs it. Friends, heads of state, the pandemic has cost the lives of more than 1,300,000 people. Let us not allow that figure to increase. The destiny of humanity depends on our response, that it be rapid and efficient and the correct one. Let us not disappoint our peoples. They are depending on what we do, but above all, let us not disappoint the future. Our actions today will determine the well-being of future generations. We all know this. Thank you very much.
I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Ecuador for the statement just made. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Botswana to introduce an address by the head of state.
Mr. President, it is a great honor for me to introduce the pre-recorded statement by His Excellency Dr. Mokgweetsi Eric Giabetsi Masisi, President of the Republic of Botswana.
Your Excellency, Mr. Volkan Bozkir, President of the General Assembly, Your Excellencies, Heads of State and Government, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, allow me at the outset to congratulate the Chair of the Non-Aligned Movement and President of the Republic of Azerbaijan, His Excellency Ilham Aliyev, for the wisdom to convene this very important special session of the United Nations General Assembly on the COVID-19 pandemic. COVID-19 continues to have devastating and far-reaching effects on our lives and livelihoods. Being part of the global village, my country, Botswana, has not been spared. While we attained a certain level of success at the onset of the pandemic, with relatively lower COVID-19 cases, much like the rest of the world, we are now, however, also realizing a surge in local cases. As at 19th November 2020, a cumulative 8,531 Botswana had tested positive, with 808 active cases, while 7,692 had recovered from the virus. We have also unfortunately recorded thus far 31 COVID-19 related deaths. Mr. President, it was not so long ago that our former President, Dr. Festus Khuntibani Mukhai, appealed for the assistance of the international community to fight HIV and AIDS. The model response that helped us contain the effects of the HIV and AIDS is now needed to ensure that together we defend our nations and peoples against the harsh effects of the COVID-19. It has reminded us of the core values that founded the United Nations, which in its preamble, and I quote, reaffirms faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women, and of nations large and small, close quote. Mr. President, the enormity of the COVID-19 scourge has necessitated that we adopt robust public health interventions to enhance our detection, containment, and preventative initiatives. My government has had to introduce measures that at times severe to minimize the impact of the virus on our still developing economy. These include, amongst others, public education and awareness, screening at all points of entry for early detection and diagnosis, isolation of suspected cases, as well as continued emphasis on the key WHO protocols of social distancing, hand hygiene, and wearing face masks in public spaces. We also continue to restrict and advise against unnecessary travel within and outside the country. These measures have nonetheless come with notable negative economic consequences, particularly on the small businesses. In an effort to mitigate some of these negative effects, especially on trade and tourism, we opened our borders from the 1st of December 2020. In addition to enacting policies to support business through tax concessions, guarantee of loans from commercial banks, and access to credit, my government has also established a national COVID-19 relief fund. The fund, which has benefited from our generous partners and Botswana at large, has been instrumental in bridging the finance gap for the provision of basic necessities such as food baskets and ensuring access to water and sanitation. COVID-19 has further exposed our over-reliance on imported food and other commodities, including critical oil resources. Being landlocked and heavily reliant on our neighbors for trade, we are a perfect example of the importance of international solidarity. Botswana is very fortunate in this regard to have had solid support of its neighbors in the SADC region to ensure continuity of trade across borders. The leadership shown by the United Nations, especially the WHO, World Health Organization, and the support received from friends across nations has also been critical in ensuring technical assistance for our health workers, as well as procurement of the personal protection equipment and testing kits. I wish to reiterate the appeal for continued assistance, particularly on ensuring uninterrupted availability of PPEs. Mr. President, despite these measures, the apparent devastating effects of the pandemic, particularly among the most vulnerable, including women and children, cannot be ignored. The higher rates of gender-based violence have exposed societal ills that require our attention. We are, therefore, grateful for the United Nations Secretary General's appeal for an immediate ceasefire in all corners of the globe, a step that will go a long way in curbing violence against women and girls, including in their homes. We also fully align with the Non-Aligned Movement's declaration adopted at the summit held on the 4th of May 2020, which, among others, established a task force to develop a database on basic humanitarian and medical needs of member states. My country further supports the call for universal affordable access to COVID-19 vaccines and therapeutics, and thus commends the World Health Assembly's adoption of a resolution in May 2020 calling for universal access to COVID-19 drugs. We also welcome the COVAX facility initiative, which seeks to ensure that developing countries will have immediate access to a vaccine, particularly targeting the most vulnerable. Mr. President, the world at large is grappling with the socio-economic effects of the COVID-19 at a time when we are also striving to achieve the SDG 30 goal targets. It is therefore imperative that we leverage on responsible technologies to provide services and scale up on implementation of SDGs. Mr. President, as I conclude, I wish to take this opportunity to express our heartfelt sympathies and condolences to all those who have lost loved ones to this pandemic. Equal appreciation goes to the frontline workers who risk their lives daily in the fight against COVID-19. Their agility and unwavering commitment embody the true spirit of humanity and is our source of optimism. I am convinced that if we combine all our efforts, we can overcome the challenge of the COVID-19 pandemic and recover as a stronger United Nations. I thank you for your attention.
I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Botswana for the statement just made. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Monaco to introduce an address by the head of state.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to introduce the pre-recorded message of His Excellency Prince Albert of Monaco. President of the General Assembly, Secretary General, ladies and gentlemen, heads of state and government, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the nature of the crisis led us to convene this special session of the General Assembly. I have the honor of taking part. Allow me to take this opportunity to warmly thank once again the Secretary General, as well as all UN staff and its agencies who have worked and continue to work relentlessly to face this pandemic. Through the 22 summary notes and the global response of the United Nations to COVID-19, Mr. Guterres has laid out the lines for a geographic, economic and social response. And by adopting the comprehensive and coordinated response to the coronavirus disease, 6 months after the pandemic started, and this organization now, the special session, a year after the virus appeared, should be a warning to us all. We cannot be satisfied with this. Mr. President, like a number of European countries, the Principality is affected by the second wave of the pandemic, which has already affected so many people in so many countries throughout the world. My government is following the circulation of the virus in Monaco on a daily basis. We do this with a dual objective to ensure that our healthcare system is not overloaded and to limit the effects on our daily life. This pandemic proves the fundamental utility of vaccination. We also need to ensure that we provide continuity in vaccinations. In parallel, we are mobilizing to ensure that there is equitable access to all vaccines against COVID-19. That's why I wanted my country to contribute to international efforts in this area, particularly through the initiative Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator, led by the WHO and its partners. Moreover, we know that it's imperative to build health systems that are more solid and to improve our capacity to address emergency situations and be better prepared for the arrival of future pandemics. The IPBES published last October an alarming report showing the link between emerging illnesses and the destruction of biodiversity. As indicated in the report, around 60% of infectious human diseases are of animal origin. The health of the environment and human health are therefore very closely linked, and that's why we have to deal with these subjects together. Also, by reinforcing the management systems for health crises, it's fundamental that we develop a preventive approach that's based on the preserving the environment. Here I'm happy to see that a number of countries have made the protection of the environment an important part of their recovery projects. We also have to reconcile an economic recovery with preservation of health. That's why I ensured that the government of Monaco in September 2020 had a recovery plan that was pragmatic, could develop further, and that was compatible with current health measures in force. Support to enterprises, businesses and workers has involved the setting up of several funds covering all sectors of activity, promoting investment and covering the energy transition and the digital transformation. Before the COVID-19 crisis, this last transformation has being speeded up due to the confinement that was put in place. However, the deployment of digital technologies must not be limited to the state and companies. It must come to other sectors as well. We saw that the closing of schools, for example, showed unequal access of families to digital technology. It's clear that if you don't have a good internet connection, you cannot continue to learn. The closing of schools does not just mean an interruption in education. It's also a challenge in terms of food and nutrition. In many countries, families count very much on the meals provided by the school. That's why, in order to ensure that a quality education continues for all, the government of Monaco wanted to keep the schools and canteens open whilst ensuring that there were sanitary conditions in place. And finally, women have been the most impacted by the consequences of the pandemic. We're seeing more and more victims of domestic violence, which is absolutely intolerable. In this regard, the Monaco Committee for the Promotion and Protection of Women's Rights launched a new campaign. It stresses violence within the family and its consequences both on the victims as well as on the direct witnesses of that violence, in particular children. Mr. President, we see the challenges that we have to overcome. They are multiple, and only a coordinated global response will enable us to fight successfully against this disease and its consequences. This health crisis is really testing the multilateral system that we've spent so many years building. And it's for this reason that since the beginning of the crisis, I wanted to join my voice with those of other leaders to launch an appeal for solidarity and for cooperation. By revealing the faults in our system, COVID-19 calls us to action and offers us a unique opportunity to start again on a better basis. We therefore have the opportunity to build this world of solidarity that is safe and resilient that we've promised to future generations. Let us not fail to seize this opportunity. I thank you for your attention.
I wish to thank the Sovereign Prince of Monaco for the statement just made. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Iraq to introduce an address by the head of state.
شكرا سيد الرئيس يسرني أن أقدم.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the pleasure to present Dr. Boham Sarah, President of Iraq's pre-recorded video message to the UNGA on COVID-19. Thank you.
السيدات والسادة السلام عليكم.
Ladies and gentlemen, may God's peace be upon you. The meetings of this special session of the General Assembly of the United Nations addressing the COVID-19 pandemic are an important opportunity, very important opportunity to continue our collective efforts virtually to address this unprecedented crisis for the international community, an opportunity that confirms that we really are one family in our suffering brought about by this pandemic, but also in our collective efforts to arrest this pandemic and rid our planet of it. In my statement at the last meeting of the General Assembly, we said that if the pandemic it continues in one village, one city, the whole of humanity will be threatened by this pandemic, which has no borders. At the beginning, at the outset, we repeat that collective suffering therefore requires collective solutions as well. This meeting is timely because it reaffirms our commitment to collective solutions to the pandemic. Our meeting is also happening at a time when all countries of the world, their peoples and governments, are following the information provided by companies, laboratories, by researchers, with regard to the imminent release of several actually, vaccines against coronavirus. We believe that access for all countries to treatment should be a priority issue. It's also essential that we guarantee fair distribution and that we limit the trade aspects of all this and therefore limit also political divergence on this issue. We also need to take into account the varying economic and financial capacities of countries and adopt measures necessary to ensure that vaccines can reach a lot of countries that don't even have means of transport or distribution that would be adequate. In principle, we are amongst the countries where the governments will buy the vaccine and ensure that it will be freely distributed to citizens, despite, as everyone would know, a very difficult economic situation in my country. My country has known 17 years of war against terrorism, large-scale war against terrorism. This continues. And there is also the previous dictatorship that really damaged our institutions and institutions such as hospitals. We also have seen a drop in the price of oil, whereas oil is the main source of the state's income. We hope that friendly countries will stand shoulder to shoulder with us to respond to our needs for the vaccine. And we hope that our circumstances will be taken into account and understood, and that we will be able to benefit from the aid necessary to address the pandemic. Despite our limited resources, relatively speaking, we have been able to contain the effects of the pandemic by the sacrifices of our doctors and other healthcare professionals and citizens. We've also had the support provided by international institutions and certain friendly countries. We, relatively speaking, have been able to alleviate the effects of the pandemic, but it's a pandemic that is a constant threat for our community and our society, and therefore it's a concern that we must address with all of our friends to ensure that we can provide our citizens with access to the vaccine. We are convinced of the importance of the results of these meetings in order to strengthen international action and the action of international agencies to guarantee vaccines for everyone that needs them and that don't necessarily have the wherewithal to pay for them. So in the spirit of optimism, we would recall that the vaccine undoubtedly is important, but it's not enough alone. The international community also needs to develop strict policies to protect the environment. We also need to have measures to ensure technological and industrial development to ensure the survival of life on the planet. We need to safeguard and protect our planet. That is a collective human responsibility that we have to take very seriously. The United Nations organization can help and can establish an ideal environment, a dialogue for agreements that would protect life on our planet. And once again, we'd like to thank the Presidency of the General Assembly and the Secretary General and all those that have been involved in preparing this special session. And we wish speedy recovery to all those that have been affected by the pandemic, wherever they may be. And we hope that our world will very quickly come back to an even keel, that people will be able to travel, work, and live safely and in prosperity. May the peace of God be with you. Thank you.
I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Iraq for the statement just made. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Marshall Islands to introduce an address by the head of state.
Mr. President, I have the distinct honor to introduce a pre-recorded message statement by the President of the Marshall Islands, David Kabua. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, It is my honor to bring to you the warm greetings of Yahweh on behalf of the people and government of the Republic of the Marshall Islands. I align my statement with that of Belize on behalf of the Alliance of Small Island States and of Tuvalu on behalf of the Pacific Island Forum. While rigorous border screening has effectively addressed risks as we slowly repatriate those stranded abroad, our national borders remain in near isolation. We are thankful for our health and security, but to do so, we will continue to pay a very heavy toll. Enforcing our isolation has severely impacted our primary economic engine of fisheries and placed several restrictions on imports and a near halt to air travel. Our substantial population abroad has also been deeply and disproportionately affected by COVID, both in economy and mortality. While as a nation and people, we will continue to meet this challenge with all our might and will, our unique situation is incredibly difficult to sustain deep into the future. As the world moves with cautious optimism towards building back better, it is vital that all nations use this as an opportunity to pursue and achieve enhanced ambition on emission reductions and to boost resilience to climate impacts. We have a key opportunity to turn commitments to the Paris Agreement and the SDGs into a firm reality. Our attention and that of the world is now closely focused on vaccination, and we are thankful where fully documented and safe candidates have appeared. I welcome the sentiments from the UN General Assembly, recently affirmed by the G20, regarding the expectation of equitable vaccine distribution. I remain cautiously optimistic that these noble sentiments will turn into action and commitment to truly ensure that no one is left behind. All nations should be particularly regarded of attempts to trade easy influence or political favor for medical assistance. It is important that the most vulnerable nations and the most vulnerable populations within those nations realize open and accountable access to vaccines and medical protection. Mr. President, we are particularly pleased that our closest partners in the Pacific have already committed to assisting us with timely delivery of vaccines as they are available early next year in a manner which protects our entire population. Similar commitments are already underway to assist our neighboring Pacific Island countries. On the basis of this commitment, we look forward to moving towards gradually reopening our borders and scaling back our isolation. Like many in the world, we are facing the difficult task of rebuilding and restructuring. The international system and the most importantly member states should search deep for the lessons learned. Where multilateral cooperations may have proved weak in the face of national self-interest, the world should not again face such a common crisis without more effective tools and the political will to use them. As a world united by shared challenges, we should all strive to emerge stronger in health and economy. This will be a vital opportunity to address critical flaws during rebuilding, but only if we all seek to make this opportunity a reality. It is particularly important not only that the most vulnerable are safeguarded, but also that the international system takes the time to carefully understand the unique circumstances and challenges, in particular for small island developing states. I can only hope that come next September, I will be able to stand shoulder to shoulder with fellow leaders in New York as a truly United Nations. Thank you and Kumon Dada.
I wish to thank the President of the Republic of the Marshall Islands for the statement just made. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Kenya to introduce an address by the head of state.
Thank you, Mr. President. It is now my honor to introduce His Excellency Mr. Uhuru Kenyatta, the President of the Republic of Kenya, to address the 31st special session of the General Assembly in response to the COVID-19 pandemic through a pre-recorded statement. Mr. President, the video is missing just the first part of it. Allow me to just fill in the gap. The President of the 75th session of the United Nations General Assembly, His Excellency Volkan Bozkır, Secretary General of the United Nations and His Excellency Antonio Guterres, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, let me take this opportunity, Mr. President, to congratulate you so far on a productive and successful 75th session, especially during the midst of such an extraordinary and unexpected era in our lives. I assure you of Kenya's full as well as constructive support. In the past few months, the COVID-19 pandemic has indiscriminately affected all of our societies, disrupted our economies, shut down our schools, and rocked our health sectors to the core. COVID-19 exposed our unpreparedness and taught us to be better equipped for the unexpected. It has accelerated efforts to construct more resilient, stronger institutions in an all-out effort to build back better and regain what is lost. I thank you, Mr. President.
Been greatly affected by COVID-19 pandemic. Our first case of the novel coronavirus disease was reported on the 13th of March, 2020. And since then, this disease has spread to all the 47 counties of our republic. To date, Kenya has reported 81,102 confirmed cases, of which 53,526 are recoveries. Regrettably, 1,427 persons have succumbed to the disease. 31 of these were healthcare workers, heroes who paid the ultimate price so that tens of thousands would be saved. In response to the COVID-19 pandemic, my government moved fast and adopted a multi-agency approach. We established the National Emergency Response Committee, comprising various state agencies, to provide direction on measures to be taken to contain the COVID-19 pandemic. Additionally, a public health emergency operations center was put in place to undertake daily disease monitoring, contact tracing, and coordination of the response to this outbreak. Like most countries in the world, our healthcare system was not quite equipped to handle a public health crisis of such magnitude. In response, at both national as well as county levels, we instituted a program of rapid capacity development. Health facilities have since been expanded with increased isolation facilities, testing capacities, ICU beds, as well as the provision of oxygen. Healthcare workers have been trained, and personal protective equipment are now being manufactured locally and supplied to health facilities across the country. We also upgraded our capacity to offer both in-hospital and at-home care. My government has instituted several containment and mitigation measures to stem the spread of COVID-19 within Kenya. These include maintaining heightened surveillance at all points of entry, health facilities, and within communities across the country. Additionally, we have rolled out hand-washing facilities and sanitization stations outside and within most of our public buildings. Furthermore, physical and social distancing, temperature monitoring, and routine street cleaning have been introduced at all public access places, including schools, religious centers, shopping malls, banks, and so on. We have also introduced a guideline on the proper use of face masks for all persons in public areas and also restricted gatherings of any nature. The implementation of these measures has demonstrably reduced the spread of the disease, giving us time to expand the health system's capacity to manage severe COVID-19 cases. Kenya, like other nations, heeded the World Health Assembly's call for the development of a one vaccine for all. In realization of this global endeavor, Kenyan scientists joined their regional, continental, and global colleagues in humanity's quest for an effective vaccine. We are playing our part through the Kenya Medical Research Institute, who are leading the process of conducting local trials for one of the most advanced COVID-19 vaccines globally. To ensure that our citizens have access to an effective vaccine as and when it becomes available in the market, my government is engaging with the COVID-19 Global Vaccine Access Facility towards this end. My government is also in the process of implementing the universal health coverage at all levels of care. Going forward, we plan to continue to strengthen decentralization of health care from high-level facilities to the community level, to promptly detect diseases of public health concern and provide adequate referral mechanisms for prompt treatment and care. In conclusion, I call upon my fellow heads of state and heads of government to increase investment in public health surveillance systems, emergency response mechanisms, and in resilient health systems. This will ensure that we are all better able to respond to pandemics such as this in the future. Equally important, countries need to remove barriers to access, to diagnosis, and care for those who need it, while also addressing the cost of treatment and ensuring equitable access to healthcare in the true spirit envisioned by the goal of universal health coverage. We know health workers locally and globally have endured the most of this disease, not only physically, but also mentally and emotionally. Therefore, we need to increase investment in the protection of our health workers and in providing them with adequate personal protective equipment supplies and all needed tools for them to discharge their sacred mandate both effectively and safely. I believe that together we can and we shall overcome and prevail. I thank you.
I wish to thank the President and Commander-in-Chief of the Defense Forces of the Republic of Kenya for the statement just made. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Bosnia and Herzegovina to introduce an address by the head of state.
Mr. President, Excellencies, it is my distinguished honor to introduce pre-recorded message by His Excellency Milorad Dodik, Chairman of the Presidency of Bosnia and Herzegovina.
Dear Mr. President of the United Nations General Assembly, In my capacity as the sub-member of the Presidency of Bosnia-Herzegovina from the Republika Srpska, I am honored to address this august assembly gathered to discuss the most important global topic of today. May I thank you for the initiative and organization of the 31st Special Session of the UN General Assembly dedicated to the fight against the COVID-19 virus, with a joint focus on and efforts against this global threat, which requires international solidarity, coordinated global action, and the hope of a final victory over this modern-day plague. The coronavirus pandemic is a global health challenge and, as such, requires a global response. The health systems in Bosnia-Herzegovina, that is, in its both entities, the Republika Srpska and the Federation of Bosnia-Herzegovina and Brčko district, have managed to appropriately respond to the challenges brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic, thanks to the plans and measures introduced by relevant institutions, the efforts of health professionals and responsible behavior of our citizens and communities as a whole. Also, the response to the COVID-19 pandemic has also benefited from strong international cooperation. A number of the response activities have been carried out with the support of the World Health Organization, the European Commission, the Directorate General for Health and Food Safety, the European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control, and many donor countries, whose cooperation we highly appreciate. Countries need financial resources to fight the pandemic and invest in recovery. In that sense, Bosnia-Herzegovina supports the stance of the UN that financial support is the key aspect of solidarity and that the UN family should respond to all aspects of the crisis. Mr. President, the economic report of the European Commission for the third quarter of 2020 shows a decline in the GDP by 9.3% relative to the previous year, which is explained by the impact of the decline in previously contracted private consumption, investment and exports. The decline in employment, which is difficult to measure, and unfavorable balance of trade have had a detrimental effect on Bosnia-Herzegovina, resulted in a current account deficit and adversely affected lending activity, including lending to households. Primary data also show that both female workers and female business owners appear to be more adversely affected by the consequences of the pandemic than their male counterparts are. In our region, the Green Corridor system, introduced at designated border crossing points, has brought about major benefits, and we plan to employ it in our trading with the EU as well. We are strengthening the cooperation within the SEPTA while fulfilling the CRM agenda and the Green Agenda as adopted at the Sofia Summit on the 10th of November 2020. Mr. President, the crisis caused by the pandemic has brought about major challenges in all walks of life, including security, where illicit production and trafficking in drugs and illegal migration and smuggling through the territory of Bosnia-Herzegovina should be particularly noted. We should emphasize that Bosnia-Herzegovina has seen mass illegal migrant arrivals since the last quarter 2017. This trend has continued in 2018, 2019, and throughout 2020. In this respect, Bosnia-Herzegovina wishes to emphasize the importance of the compliance with and delivery on the commitments under international law governing these issues. Mr. President, at the early stages of the epidemic that hit the world, rich countries seem to have disregarded the small ones, and regional organizations acted as if they had had neither the strategy nor the resources to help either their members or anyone else. In those first weeks, even the European Union dithered and revealed all the weaknesses of a big system, unprepared for the scale and depth of the crisis that befell us. In such a situation, it is the legitimate right of every country, especially those with limited resources, to seek help from friends on the international stage, to seek a way out of a crisis that places the most valuable asset any country has in jeopardy, and that is human lives. Never again, in any crisis, should any country, any nation, feel alone and abandoned by everyone. This should be the task of each and every one of us. This is, in fact, the task, purpose and goal of the United Nations. In these uncertain times, Mankind needs solidarity and togetherness, not only locally, but regionally and globally. This pandemic has clearly proven that indeed no one is safe unless everyone is safe. Thank you for your attention.
To introduce the pre-record statement of Excellency João Manuel Gonçalves Lourenço, President of the Republic of Angola, on the 31st section of the COVID. Thank you.
Excelentíssimo Senhor
Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations Organization, Your Excellency Volkan Bozkır, the President of the United Nations General Assembly, Your Excellency Tedros Ghebreyesus, Director General of the World Health Organization, ladies and gentlemen, in this year of 2020, the humanity finds itself confronted with an unexpected threat to its survival, the COVID-19 pandemic, which today constitutes the most serious challenge to the normal functioning of the health, social, and economic structures of almost all countries in the world. In such a way that only a collective and collaborative action can overcome such a challenge. Since the beginning of the year, Angola has reacted and applied strict measures to contain the pandemic by developing a flexible multi-sectoral contingency plan that is adapted to the country's epidemiological profile. Epidemiological surveillance throughout national territory was strengthened, which included, amongst other measures, the establishment and training of rapid response teams and the health monitoring at international entry points, with implementation of quarantine and mobility control between the different regions of the country. We have progressively increased our testing capacity for RT-PCR and serological and antigen testing. We have built infrastructures exclusively dedicated to the treatment of the COVID-19 existing cases, such as field hospitals, and have adapted all existing hospitals to deal with the cases, and have increased the number of available beds by 5,000, of which more than 1,000 is meant for intensive care. At this moment, we only have community transmission in Luanda, the country's capital and the most populous city, while the remaining provinces of the country sustain occasional outbreaks with known sources of transmission. Despite the growing number of positive cases, totaling 14,742 as of 24 November, the transmissibility of the virus from person to person has been decreasing, standing at 0.9%. The fact the pandemic has negatively affected the country's economic financial resources, as well as the economic and social development programs of the country, has not prevented Angola from continuing to make efforts and take actions aimed at reducing the poverty rates and improve the quality and coverage of basic education and provide universal access to primary health care, especially to the most vulnerable families. The government of Angola has so far employed its own resources in a sum that amounts to $164,600,000. This amount includes an emergency financing of $14,400,000 from the World Bank. Despite this, more assistance will be needed, especially for accessing vaccines that will prove to be efficacious. The accelerated development of safe and effective vaccines against SARS-CoV-2 virus, with innovative technologies, is an example of what humanity is capable of doing when threatened. I therefore would like to welcome the effort made by the COVAX facility in mobilizing resources that will ensure, in an equitable manner, the vaccination of at least 20% of the population in the middle and low-income countries. However, I believe that this effective collaborative effort must be increased in order to ensure global coverage that will curb the transmission of the virus and allow the return to normality, preventing, therefore, the worsening of disparity among countries. Angola has a vaccination plan that will initially cover 90% of its priority population. On behalf of Angola, I would like to express our recognition and profound gratitude to the World Health Organization, as well as to regional institutions, the African Union and SADC, for the manner how they have spearheaded the coordination of efforts that have enabled each of our country to face the enormous challenge that COVID-19 represents for humanity. Thank you very much.
I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Montenegro to introduce an address by the head of state.
Mr. President, I have the honor to introduce a pre-recorded video statement by His Excellency Mr. Milo Đukanović, President of Montenegro.
Ekscelencije, dame i gospodo, zadovoljstvo mi je da vas sve pozdravim. Godinu dana od otkrivanja prvog slučaja novog koronavirusa, naše zemlje, međunarodna zajednica, organizacije i akteri na različitim nivoima pokušavaju da daju najbolji mogući odgovor na višestruke posljedice pandemije, prije svega po živote i zdravlje naših građana, a onda i naše ekonomije. Specijalna sesija Generalne skupštine je, vjerujem, prilika da tome damo kvalitativan doprinos. Pandemija COVID-19 sigurno je dodatno iscrpila multilateralizam, ali ga nije slomila. Naše učešće danas potvrda je
The special session of the General Assembly gives us an opportunity to contribute to the situation. COVID-19 pandemic represents an additional burden on multilateralism. However,
neophodnije nego ikad ranije.
Participation in this session is essential.
Su postaju vidljiviji i odlučniji. Problemi su ogromni, izazovi višestruki.
It's important to understand.
Pandemija je bacila na koljena svjetsku ekonomiju. Globalna ekonomija prolazi kroz najdublju recesiju posle Drugog svjetskog rata. Ekonomske aktivnosti, putovanja, lanci snabdijevanja doživljavaju kolaps.
Currently there is
pokušavaju da pomognu i održe privrednu aktivnost. Najpogođeniji bivaju najranjiviji dijelovi društva, a prava i slobode.
National governments are trying to contain the spread of the infection through economic measures. At the same time, incentives are being implemented to limit economic activity. We have often stated that without a comprehensive, coordinated effort,
naročito u ranjivim društvima sa nedovoljno snažnim i izgrađenim demokratskim institucijama. Duboko vjerujem da je ovo prilika da ujedinimo snage ka boljem, pravičnijem, otpornijem i održivom post-COVID svijetu. Svijetu u kojem će realizacija agende 2030 biti izvjesnija, a najviše vrijednosti demokratije, slobode i ljudskih prava prihvaćene i poštovane. Oporavak mora biti održiv i inkluzivan, a mi otporniji i pripremljeniji za neku sljedeću pandemiju. Prilika je za novi početak globalne saradnje i poziv za akciju. Iako je pandemija dodatno usložila i onako kompleksan put ka ostvarenju agende 2030, držim da su ciljevi održivog razvoja u ovom trenutku jedini relevantan i globalno prihvaćen putokaz za suočavanje sa nizom izazova, poput klimatskih promjena, porasta nejednakosti, očuvanja i zaštite biodiverziteta, ekonomske neizvjesnosti. Mnogi će i danas govoriti o brojnim negativnim pojavama koje su bile naročito vidljive u prvim mjesecima izbijanja pandemije. Zloupotreba informacija, globalno nadmetanje, nemogućnost nabavke osnovne zaštitne medicinske opreme, zatvaranje u nacionalne okvire i manjak solidarnosti. Ipak, ozbiljnost situacije zahtijeva našu prevashodnu usmjerenost na rješenje problema i
the approach. Effective coordination, investments that rely on science and technology, and timely communication aimed at strengthening trust are of decisive importance. The first confirmation that we are on the right path will be a creation of conditions for the availability and timely distribution of the expected vaccine. Post-COVID world should be a world of closer cooperation, more solidarity, and stronger empathy. As I recently said in the Paris Peace Forum, the pandemic has shown that all of us are vulnerable, regardless of our nation, confession, color of skin, or wealth. The consequences are devastating for everyone. Let us do our best to ensure that recovery does not become a privilege reserved only for some of us.
Thank the President of the Republic of Montenegro for the statement just made. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Afghanistan to introduce an address by the head of state.
Thank you, Mr. President, Excellencies, dear colleagues. Today, I have the great honor and the distinct privilege to introduce the pre-recorded statement of His Excellency Dr. Muhammad Ashraf Ghani, the President of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you, Mr. President, for giving me the floor and for organizing the special session of the General Assembly. I also want to thank the President of Azerbaijan as the chair of the non-aligned movement for taking the initiative to organize a special session on the COVID-19 pandemic. I welcome the opportunity to share with you what we have learned here in Afghanistan in dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic and how it has informed us in preparing for the second wave. I would like to offer my condolences and sympathies to all those who've lost a loved one to COVID-19 and to those who've suffered the most losses from this pandemic, including the United States, Brazil, and India. Dear colleagues and friends, the COVID-19 pandemic came to Afghanistan at the end of February via Herat province, which shares a border with Iran. We moved quickly in anticipation that the virus would hit us hard. After analysis and consultation with diverse groups across Afghan society, we planned the response to the pandemic according a 5-phase approach to the crisis: acknowledgement, diffusion, adversity, relief, and recovery. The virus peaked in June with an infection rate of 76% and then went into steady decline, with the infection rate fluctuating daily between 6% and 25% during the fall. As a result of our urgent action, we managed to maintain relatively low mortality rates. We managed our response to not jeopardize livelihoods in the long term or increase already high levels of poverty and food insecurity. These are lessons we learned. First, the vast scale of the disruptive and destructive effects of the COVID-19 pandemic is becoming clearer by the day. We saw the short-term impacts almost immediately: the loss of lives, the loss of jobs, the downturn in the economy. But the medium to long-term impacts we have not yet fully grasped. So while we cope with the immediate impact, we need to look ahead and prepare for the long-term effects. Second, the impact of the pandemic has been global. No country has been left untouched, and yet the response has been largely national. We've been unable, as an international community, to fully take advantage of the interconnected nature of our work to combat the disease. The world had an opportunity to respond to the pandemic with an unprecedented level of unity and solidarity. Instead, we've experienced divisions. A global focal point would have made the response more effective and coordinated, and global resources should have been mobilized on a larger scale. We commend the Secretary General and the United Nations for their role in tireless work. Afghanistan is proud to have contributed to the global response as a co-coordinator for COVID-19 related initiatives in the General Assembly, together with Croatia. The omnibus resolution, facilitated by a permanent mission, created a common normative framework for the response. It is now up to all of our governments to implement the resolution and better coordinate our response to the second wave and the socioeconomic impacts. Third, this pandemic has not been a leveler as expected, but instead it has exacerbated existing gaps and inequalities across developed and developing nations. Countries in special situations have been specially hard hit. For example, we, as a poor country, like many others around the world, were not able to design and implement effective stimulus packages. We also had to be very careful in instituting lockdowns to avoid inflicting serious damage on our economy and people's livelihoods, which could have inflicted more suffering than the virus itself. This will continue to be the case even as a vaccine becomes available, because administering a vaccine requires capabilities and infrastructure that poor countries simply do not have. The role of multilateral organizations in the joint distribution of the vaccine will be critical. Our call for the vaccine to be a global public good must be loud and clear. Now the second wave of the pandemic is at our doorstep. We face this wave during the winter season with very little understanding of how cold weather, particularly under the conditions of poverty, will affect the nature of the pandemic. We now know that women have suffered the most as a result of the pandemic and experienced higher levels of insecurity. Today, we must take a strong stand against domestic violence and reaffirm our support for the Secretary General call for peace at home. Ending the shadow of pandemic affecting millions of women and girls is critical for a fair and protected world for all. I hope that as we enter the second wave, we as an international community will be able to draw from the lessons learned. For one, a clear phased approach needs to be designed and replicated nationally, regionally, and globally. This approach should be informed not just by the information provided via instant analysis, but more importantly by patterns that emerge in the way the virus is manifested globally. Second, now we are in a better position to plan to ensure food security and basic human security in the face of subsequent waves. We must make sure that supply chains that were disrupted during the first wave are either restored or alternatives put in place to ensure basic needs are met. The pandemic transformed the way we do business, the way we communicate, the way we live. But it's not all negative. COVID pushed the digitalization of the world at a speed that was inconceivable. In moving into subsequent waves of the pandemic, we need to embrace digital technology to further a global dialogue around policy, accessing and distributing the vaccine. To take advantage of these technologies, more must, however, be done to address the digital divide. We will not be able to return to our pre-pandemic ways of communicating and governing. The pandemic opened up new possibilities for coordination and cooperation. For example, telemedicine and distance learning. We need to embrace this change. Lastly, because the first and second waves have exacerbated structural poverty and increased situational poverty, we must create a common approach to securing livelihoods and ensuring momentum in the economy while also promoting COVID awareness. Afghanistan is located at the heart of Asia. We have many open or semi-open borders and frontiers. This means we can be either a center for spreading the virus or containing it. We are trying to be the latter, and we hope we can achieve that if we work together as a global community to act upon the lessons learned from the first wave. Thank you.
I wish to thank the President of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan for the statement just made. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Democratic Republic of Congo to introduce an address by the head of state.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, it is my signal honor and privilege to introduce His Excellency Félix Antoine Tshilombo Tshisekedi, President of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. He is going to deliver his statement to the first special session of the General Assembly. I thank you.
Monsieur le Président de l'Assemblée.
President of the United Nations General Assembly, Your Excellencies, heads of state and government. Secretary General of the United Nations, ladies and gentlemen, the Democratic Republic of the Congo saw its first case of COVID-19 on the 10th of March 2020. To date, the total of confirmed cases in my country is 12,469, out of which 11,495 cures, 92% that is, 333 deaths, which means a mortality rate of 2.6%. The impact of the COVID-19 pandemic was felt in the DRC in several sectors, including the socioeconomic sector, to the extent that 79% of the poorest households were impacted by the rising food prices and loss of revenue. But thanks to the innovative strategies we deployed, we managed to bring the pandemic under control and minimize its impact both in the social and economic sphere. And these strategies can be described as follows. First, the authorities took ownership of the strategy at the highest level of the state, and this resulted in the proclamation of the public health emergency for 6 months. This was accompanied by the closure of borders, isolation measures between provinces, and strict confinement measures, and this was done to protect our people against contamination from outside and internal spread. Then we put together a technical secretariat, which is to manage the healthcare work nationally. And there was also a presidential task force, and their mission is to help me in monitoring, overseeing, and assessing all of the prevention and mitigation activities. Next, we had all these structures implement all of the activities that were deployed in order to manage the COVID-19 pandemic. And these activities strengthen strategic communication, confined the epicenter of the epidemic, and at the same time strengthened the barrier measures, integrated the combat against COVID-19 in our National Public Health Center with a great deal of decentralization. We also worked on research. We did triage amongst migrant workers at the entry point, and we strengthened the decentralization of COVID-19 work throughout the country and standardized treatment procedures. And this enabled us to control the COVID-19 pandemic in the DRC and to limit its spread in some provinces of the country. However, in and of themselves, they cannot explain the outcome. Some have said and continue saying, rightly or wrongly, that there were other factors that came in and resulted in this negative curve of the pandemic, namely the age distribution, given that we have a great many young people, and there is a low level of morbidity. Nonetheless, since October 2020, we have been seeing an increase in cases, an increase in hospitalization cases of COVID-19. This was reported by our health entities. This could be explained by a slight laxity when it comes to barrier measures by the people, and also by the fact that the air traffic resumed with those countries where the epidemic is raging. So in order to face this situation, the government of the DRC is considering strengthening the activities aimed at combating the pandemic so as to mitigate as much as possible the negative ramification of a possible second wave on the health and the well-being of our people. Mr. President, regionally speaking now, we had a high-level summit. It was convened on my initiative in Goma on the 7th October 2020. And there, the Democratic Republic of the Congo raised the possibility of developing a cross-border plan for combating COVID-19, doing this together with our countries. And I would like to underscore here the fact that my country benefits from the support of the international community as we are fighting the pandemic. And this support has enabled my country to put together mitigation activities against COVID-19 and to do it in an effective manner. And that is why, on behalf of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, I would like to welcome, congratulate, and thank all at the same time the World Health Organization and other technical and financial partners. Thank them for accompanying us as we are fighting COVID-19. I thank you.
I wish to thank the President of the Democratic Republic of the Congo for the statement just made. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Guyana to introduce an address by the head of state.
I have the honor, Mr. President, to introduce a pre-recorded statement by His Excellency Dr. Mohamed Irfan Ali, President of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana.
The Cooperative Republic of Guyana welcomes this 31st special session of the General Assembly of the United Nations in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. We applaud the efforts which have been made by United Nations in responding to this pandemic, particularly by UN's humanitarian and socio-economic response and its ongoing efforts for a post-COVID-19 recovery plan. The United Nations has demonstrated the efficiency and necessity of global cooperation. It has been in the forefront of efforts to help countries mitigate the effects of this pandemic. The United Nations efforts represent one of history's greatest rescue missions. This 31st special session comes at a time when the world eagerly awaits the authorization of vaccines, which have been developed to help in the public health fight against the coronavirus. The United Nations must continue to be in the forefront, as it has been over the past 8 months, in piloting the international rollout of mass immunization for developing countries. The pandemic has presented difficulties for all segments of our society, particularly our children. Most of them have been out of school for months, and their normal childhood routines have been constricted. Guyana recognizes the impact which the pandemic has had on them. As such, we join in supporting UNICEF's 6-point plan, which provides a response aimed at ensuring that our children are protected and are catered for in the global recovery efforts, which will follow the remission of this pandemic. Guyana hereby commits to ensuring that our children are able to continue to learn by closing the national digital divide, enabling improved primary health care and access to vaccine by children, eradicating child poverty, effecting, where necessary, mental health support interventions for children and young people, enacting greater protections and support measures for vulnerable children, and encouraging access to improved water, hygiene, and sanitation. The pandemic has emphasized the need for change in global relations. In this regard, I wish to reiterate my support for the United Nations Secretary General's call for a new global deal with a new social contract. As I noted in my intervention to the meeting of heads of government and states on financing the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development in an era of COVID-19 and beyond, a new global deal will allow for the effective transfer of resources, financial, intellectual, and technological, to developing countries and facilitate also a fairer sharing of the benefits of globalization. A new social contract will guarantee the more effective use of these resources for sustainable development. A new era will soon be upon us. The world looks forward to beating this pandemic and hastening international recovery. The process will be made easier by the ushering in of a new era in global relations, one which will herald the magnificence of multilateralism, spearheaded by the United Nations. I thank you and continue to stay safe. God bless you all.
I wish to thank the President of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana for the statement just made. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of South Africa to introduce an address by the head of state.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to introduce the President of the Republic of South Africa and Chairperson of the African Union, His Excellency Matamela Cyril Ramaphosa, to address the United Nations General Assembly Special Session on the COVID-19 pandemic. I thank you.
Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Antonio Guterres, President of the UN General Assembly, Excellencies, we meet in this important special session of the UN General Assembly at a time when the coronavirus pandemic continues to spread in many parts of the world. This pandemic has demonstrated once again how intertwined are the fortunes of the nations of the world. Since the start of the pandemic, there has been coordinated international action to ensure that all countries are able to respond effectively. This collaboration has been of particular benefit to developing economies, which continue to shoulder the burden of poverty, inequality, and underdevelopment. South Africa deeply appreciates the assistance, the advice, and solidarity it has received from the international community. As a result of the decisive measures we took from the onset of the pandemic, we managed to delay the transmission of the virus. We succeeded in preparing our health facilities, and by doing so, we've saved many lives. We put in place emergency relief measures to support individuals, households, and companies that were in distress, and have now embarked on a reconstruction and recovery plan to return our economy to growth and job creation. As the African continent, we have driven a deliberate, targeted, and coordinated response to COVID-19. Led by the African Union, we established a COVID-19 response fund to contain the pandemic in member states and enable their economies to recover. The African Union appointed several special envoys to solicit concrete support for the continental effort as pledged by the G20, the European Union, and international financial institutions. We also launched the groundbreaking African Medical Supplies Platform to facilitate access for all African countries to critical equipment and supplies. We have also established a COVID-19 African Vaccine Acquisition Task Team to ensure that African countries are able to access and distribute affordable and effective vaccines without delay. In addition, an African Green Stimulus Program is being developed to ensure our economic recovery takes place in a more sustainable manner. As African countries, we will continue to need substantial support to recover from the pandemic. We reiterate our call for a comprehensive economic stimulus package for Africa, for a suspension of interest payment on Africa's external and public debt, and for the lifting of all economic sanctions imposed on Zimbabwe and Sudan to allow them to adequately respond to the pandemic. It is only through multilateral cooperation that we can overcome this global emergency. We must continue to support the World Health Organization as the lead UN agency mandated to coordinate the global effort. We must continue to drive a holistic response to COVID-19 that recognizes the relationship between health, social, economic, and environmental measures. This pandemic must not detract from our commitment to both the Paris Agreement on climate change and the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. We must place gender equality at the center and the forefront of our recovery efforts. To ensure that there is equitable access for all to an effective vaccine, we call on UN member states to work with the WHO on the Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator and the COVAX facility. In the spirit of solidarity and cooperation, let us continue to work together to overcome this crisis and build a better, safer, more equitable, peaceful, and prosperous world. I thank you.
I wish to thank the President of the Republic of South Africa for the statement just made. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Suriname to introduce an address by the head of state.
Mr. President, it is my distinct honor to introduce the pre-recorded statement of the President of the Republic of Suriname, His Excellency, Mr. Chandrika Prasad Santokhi. Thank you.
Your Excellency Volkan Bozkir, President of the General Assembly, Your Excellency Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, Excellencies, colleagues, ministers, and permanent representatives, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. President, my delegation aligns itself with a statement by His Excellency Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, President of the United Mexican State, on behalf of CELAC, and the statement by His Excellency Ilham Aliyev, President of the Republic of Azerbaijan, on behalf of the non-aligned movement. When considering the global impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on our economies, the health and well-being of our people, and sustainable development, this session is yet another confirmation that multilateralism and international cooperation are indispensable. As a result of the pandemic's outbreak, our public health, social protection, and education system, environmental, agricultural, as well as other production sectors have undergone tremendous pressure. The government has taken several measures to prevent the further spread of the virus, including far-reaching ones such as closing of air and maritime borders for regular passenger traffic, except for flights for repatriation, but also closing of schools, temporary restriction of the movement of people, and awareness-raising campaigns to alert the public regarding prevention. Additional emergency measures have been implemented to address the socio-economic effects of the pandemic while safeguarding health, including mental health, such as the creation of a social protection system and targeted economic measures to support vulnerable groups and businesses in our society. For Suriname, the implementation of these targeted COVID-19 measures entails committing limited financial means, amplifying our vulnerability while facing already immense financial, macroeconomic imbalances, as well as a heavy debt portfolio. In this respect, the government appreciates the solidarity and the support it has received thus far from international partners in the field of medical service and technical cooperation to enable all stakeholders to address the COVID-19 situation in Suriname. Suriname was the first in the region upholding the democratic process of holding free and fair elections during the outbreak of COVID-19. The government is continuously monitoring, evaluating, and adjusting the measures to find the proper balance between the health of the people and the economy. This, despite the national and international financial constraints, in particular high national debt and the challenges in relation to access to concessional financing. In this context, steadily and cautious reopening of the economy is well considered, taking into account the relevant protocols for each sector. Mr. President, we welcome the efforts made by the United Nations Secretary General, the international financial institutions, and other multilateral entities in response to the pandemic. At the same time, we note with great concern that middle-income countries are left behind and cannot benefit from many of these initiatives. We call, therefore, for an integrated response to the pandemic, and in this regard, welcome the initiative of Canada and Jamaica, supported by the United Nations Secretary General on financing for development in the era of COVID-19 and beyond. In addition, we welcome the initiative launched for our region by Costa Rica and the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, ECLAC, namely the Fund to Alleviate COVID-19 Economics as well as Caribbean Resilience Funds, proposed by the Executive Director of ECLAC. My government calls for a stronger advocacy role of the United Nations towards the international community and in particular the international financial institutions to design and execute region-specific and country-specific strategies to assist countries to gradually building more resilient financial, economic, social, environmental, and security systems and towards sustainable recovery. Consideration of specific financing for development opportunities and measures such as debt relief, suspensions and/or writing off debts, access to concessional financing, special arrangement for grants and soft loans, budgetary support to strengthen our public health infrastructure could enable us to building resilience in times of crisis. In this regard, we also note the process in the development of vaccines and underscore the importance of ensuring that vaccines will be equally accessible and affordable for all. In closing, Mr. President, let us not forget that the principal aim of multilateralism is to unite, assist in building strong and resilient communities and to strengthen democracy, the rule of law, and good governance through collective actions and inspired by solidarity, respect, and understanding. Building back better strongly depends on the interpretation and implementation that we give to the kind of multilateralism that this pandemic demands from us. I thank you.
I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Suriname for the statement just made. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Colombia to introduce an address by the head of state.
Gracias.
Thank you, President. It is a pleasure for me now to present the pre-recorded statement of the President of the Republic of Colombia, His Excellency Iván Duque Márquez, within this special session of the General Assembly on COVID-19. President Duque has addressed the pandemic in a decisive way, showing great leadership at the national and regional level and reaffirming his full belief in multilateralism. Thank you very much, President.
La crisis sanitaria.
health, economic and social crisis brought about by this pandemic has been the greatest challenge for the world since World War II. This virus has plunged all countries into an unprecedented economic recession, which has disproportionately affected the most vulnerable people and communities. Since the beginning of the pandemic, Colombia has stuck by its commitment to safeguard Colombians' health, to care for the most vulnerable, to protect people's jobs, and to promote a responsible and progressive recovery of the economy, while we also preserve the progress we had made in terms of equality. We have taken the right decisions at the right time to address this pandemic. Colombia was the first country in Latin America with local diagnostic test capacity. In addition, thanks to the work of our Health Ministry and the Emergency Management Fund, we have been able to double the number of intensive care units in Colombia. They now number more than 11,200. We have also seen progress in terms of the measures to curb the spread of the disease and to promote its suppression by applying epidemiological vigilance measures and sanitation controls, such as the PRAS program, which is the Program for Testing, Tracing and Sustainable Selective Isolation. With this, we have sought to direct our measures to enhance public health, to increase testing capacity, to facilitate the identification of positive tests, and in particular to facilitate the tracing of those tests. We have also mitigated the socio-economic effects of the pandemic. We have done so through programs such as Families in Action, Youth in Action, and Greater Colombia. We have also set up the solidarity-based income, which allowed us to reach 3 million people who were not benefiting from any state program. With all of these measures, we have been able to reach more than 10 million households. To protect people's jobs, we set up the program for support to formal employment, which allowed us to subsidize 40 or 50% of people's pay, which has helped more than 3 million workers. Colombia has been an active member of the WHO Executive Board. In that scenario, we have advocated the universal equitable access for all countries to vaccines and treatments. We recognize, therefore, the importance of immunization to COVID-19 as a global public good. We also signed a formal agreement for the COVAX mechanism. This is a facility, a tool, which will make it possible for the vaccines to be equitably distributed. We underscore the immense work undertaken by the WHO and the PAHO. They have promoted a global response based on science and focused on people. I therefore repeat the importance of multilateralism as a tool to overcome this crisis and to permanently remove the barriers to build a fairer and more equitable world. We therefore reaffirm our commitment to strengthening global governance and to promote a sustainable recovery so that we can move towards more resilient societies. Thank you very much.
I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Colombia for the statement just made, and I now give the floor for the distinguished representative of Montenegro to introduce an address by the head of state.
Thank you, Madam President. I have the honor to introduce a pre-recorded video statement by His Excellency Mr. Milo Đukanović, President of Montenegro.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure for me to greet you all. It's been a year since the first case of the novel coronavirus was detected. Our countries, the international community, organizations and stakeholders on different levels are putting efforts into providing the best possible response to the multiple consequences of the pandemic, primarily for the lives and health of our citizens and then also for our economies. Special session of the General Assembly is an opportunity for all of us to give a high-quality contribution too. The COVID-19 pandemic has certainly placed an additional strain on multilateralism, but it didn't break it. The fact that we are participating in this session today confirms that we accept reality and understand that working in silos cannot solve global issues. Ignoring a high degree of interdependence, particularly in case of global health threats, entails immeasurable dangers. Efficient and inclusive multilateralism is needed today more than ever. That is why it is encouraging to see that the awareness of this matter is growing and that the efforts pursuing this aim are becoming more visible and more determined. Problems are enormous, challenges are multiple, and the final consequences cannot be grasped yet. The pandemic brought the global economy to its knees, as well as global politics, science, and medicine. Global economy is going through the deepest recession after the World War II. Economic activities, travels, and supply chains are in collapse. National governments are trying to contain the spread of the infection by restrictive measures, while at the same time, depending on their economic strength, they are using incentives to try to help and sustain economic activities. The most affected are the most vulnerable parts of our societies, while rights and freedoms of our citizens keep being under pressure. We have repeated several times that without a comprehensive and coordinated response, global leadership, solidarity among the countries, and individual responsibility, we will not be successful in the fight against the most serious challenge in the history of the United Nations. The health crisis and the ensuing economic crisis can easily lead to destabilization and uncertainty, particularly in vulnerable societies with insufficiently developed and weak democratic institutions. I am deeply convinced that this is an opportunity for all of us to join forces pursuing a better, fairer, more resilient, and more sustainable post-COVID world. The world where the implementation of the 2030 Agenda will be more certain and the highest values of democracy, freedom, and human rights will be accepted and respected. Recovery has to be sustainable and inclusive, and we have to be more resilient and better prepared for any new pandemic that might affect us. This must be an opportunity for a new start of global cooperation and call for action. Although the pandemic additionally complicated the already complex part of implementing the 2030 Agenda, I think that Sustainable Development Goals are at this moment the only relevant and globally accepted roadmap for facing numerous challenges like climate change, growing inequality, preservation and protection of biodiversity, and economic uncertainty. Many of us will talk today about numerous negative phenomena that were particularly visible in the first months after the outbreak: abuse of information, global competition, impossibility to procure basic medical protection equipment, and lack of solidarity. Still, given how serious the situation is, we have to be focused primarily on solving the problems and changing the approach. Effective coordination, investments that rely on science and technology, and timely communication aimed at strengthening trust are of decisive importance. The first confirmation that we are on the right path will be a creation of conditions for the availability and timely distribution of the expected vaccine. Post-COVID world should be a world of closer cooperation, more solidarity, and stronger empathy. As I recently said in the Paris Peace Forum, the pandemic has shown that all of us are vulnerable, regardless of our nation, confession, color of skin, or wealth. The consequences are devastating for everyone. Let us do our best to ensure that recovery does not become a privilege reserved only for some of us.
Ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies, the COVID-19 pandemic continues to be a major risk to the humanity. Families have lost dear members, and communities have been profoundly shattered. This health crisis has transposed into other sectors of our societies, with our economies suffering an especially heavy setback. With its health, economic, social, humanitarian, and security dimension, the pandemic has tested our countries in unprecedented ways and has reminded us how interconnected we are. With the suffering it causes, the pandemic exposes the systemic weaknesses and inequalities in our world. In North Macedonia, the coronavirus has taken its toll in human lives, sector, and the weakened economy. In order to alleviate the heavy burden from our health workers, our government recently declared a state of crisis on the entire territory for a period of 30 days. This will help us use the capacities of the army and the resources of the private health sector in order to control more effectively the spread of the virus and save as many human lives as possible. This great danger has also provided an opportunity for our countries and peoples to demonstrate unity, solidarity, and multilateral cooperation. On behalf of the Macedonian citizens, I would like to thank the United Nations and the World Health Organization for their leadership in coordinating the global response to control and contain the spread of COVID-19. In the same time, we are grateful to all the countries and organizations that have supported us with medical equipment, materials, and shared knowledge and experience. The pandemic also poses a moral challenge. The economy may suffer, but human lives are infinitely precious. So saving human lives should take precedence over everything else. In the same time, our efforts to control the spread of the virus must not be at the expense of the fundamental rights and freedoms. This includes healthcare and economic stimulus to be provided to everybody in need. While fighting the coronavirus, we must make sure we do not tolerate the spread of the viruses of racism, extremism, discrimination, and xenophobia. A systemic threat, like the pandemic, requires a systemic response. That would include both immediate and long-term actions. We need to continue working together in building resilient, well-governed, responsive, accountable, people-centered health systems. Health products with certified quality should be available and affordable for all. The big step in the right direction certainly was the establishment of the global COVAX program for procurement of vaccines, which has to make easy and balanced access to the vaccines to all the people in the world. Dear friends, allow me at the end to emphasize that many challenges will remain even in the post-COVID period. The road to socio-economic and even mental recovery for many of us will be long and complicated. But there is no alternative. The humankind has to come together again in order to rebuild a world in which no human being is left behind. Thank you for your attention.
I wish to thank the President of the Republic of North Macedonia for the statement he just made, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Latvia to introduce an address by the head of state.
Madam President, Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it's my distinct honor to introduce the pre-recorded statement by His Excellency Egils Levits, President of the Republic of Latvia. I thank you.
Mr. President, Excellencies, in the time of a global pandemic, let me first pay tribute to the global medical community for their dedicated and professional work. I would like also to salute all key workers who keep our basic services running and the scientists who are working to develop an effective vaccine. Now, more than ever, we need to be united, show solidarity, and cooperate closely to address the pandemic and its devastating consequences. We can only succeed through the multilateral approach. This special UN session underlines the central role of the United Nations system in achieving our goals. The World Health Organization is the leading and coordinating authority in addressing global health challenges. We must strengthen it through reforms that increase its effectivity. Latvia has financially contributed to the World Health Organization through the Global Humanitarian Response Plan for COVID-19. It was our response to the global appeal of the UN Secretary General to act together and show solidarity. Latvian scientists actively participate in vaccine development. Our government took quick and decisive action to ensure contact tracking, social distancing, and testing availability, as well as development of digital solutions. It is a careful effort to limit economic losses while safeguarding public health. The government, in close cooperation with the private sector, introduced 3 main digital solutions. An e-parliament platform so that our national parliament could continue legislative functions in lockdown mode. The government, too, meets online. A TV channel, Your Class, and other digital tools to enable remote schooling. And the first nationally endorsed contact tracing app, Stop COVID, which is compatible with other European tracing apps. 25% of mobile internet users have already downloaded this app. This app ensures anonymity, essential for respecting the privacy of infected persons. In terms of economic recovery, Latvia fully supports the UN Secretary General's call to build back better. It is not necessary or even desirable to return to the old normality in every way. Our production and consumption patterns have been interrupted by the pandemic. While we all work together to revive and save our economies, we also have an opportunity to rethink our approach and introduce more sustainable solutions. In conclusion, I would like to emphasize the critical need to counter misinformation during the pandemic and beyond. Access to free, reliable, and science-based information through reputable media is essential. This challenge must be recognized and dealt with not only by governments, but also by international organizations. At the United Nations, Latvia will continue to raise awareness of the need of counter disinformation. Let us all work together to save lives and start sustainable recovery around the globe. Thank you.
I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Latvia for the statement just made, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Estonia to introduce an address by the head of state.
Thank you. Madam President, Excellencies, I have the honor to introduce the pre-recorded statement of Her Excellency Ms. Kersti Kaljulaid, the President of the Republic of Estonia.
Dear Secretary General Antonio Guterres, dear President of the General Assembly, members of the United Nations, as we attend today's special session, the world is facing the second wave of the COVID-19 pandemic, and most of our societies are in lockdowns. So far, the focus of our countries has been saving lives and at the same time getting our economies back on track, trying to increase the resilience of societies. As we adapt to the fact of living in the COVID-19 world, the focus has rightly shifted